Hey folks, thanks for coming out to talk with us this evening. So as Nick said, I'm going to talk a bit about the State Policy Network. I do research for Greenpeace USA. Greenpeace has presence around the world, but we have offices in different countries. One in the United States here is the one that I work for. I research the bad guys. Okay, so why do I care about ALEC? I care about ALEC because ALEC is a key cog in the machine that has convinced so many people in this country that climate change scientists are full of it and that climate change is not real, despite the massive costs that climate change is already imposing upon societies all over the world. Just so you know that in the scientific community, those people that are credible in the field, that have the right expertise, that are researching, that are publishing in peer-reviewed journals where other scientists had to vet it before it was allowed to go to publish, 97% of those people know that climate change is happening and it's caused by humans, mostly by burning fossil fuels. The White House has put out a report this week saying that climate change is going to impose $150 billion a year on the U.S. economy, looking forward for the next several decades. And a peer-reviewed study in Germany estimates that the cost of inaction outweighs the cost of doing something about climate change by $12 trillion. So being lazy is a $12 trillion price tag around the world by 2100, I have to say. So what is this thing up here? A lot of the groups that we talk about in the State Policy Network actually were part of this. This is a snippet from a memo from Brown and Williamson that they wrote in 1969. A lot of you are probably familiar with the tobacco trials that took place in the 1990s, where we finally got tobacco companies to be held accountable for lying to the public for decades and decades about the dangers of smoking cigarettes. People were dying. Tobacco companies were hiring any kook they could find to say that cigarettes didn't harm your health, and they dragged it out for many, many years, and they were very successful in their mission, which was just delaying long enough to make as much money as possible for that period of time. This memo is the conspiracy plan for it, quite literally. Doubt is our product, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. That's very similar. I'm going to pause. How many people were at my presentation yesterday? Okay, great. I'm not going to repeat too much of this then. I just want to point out that in 1998, the American Petroleum Institute borrowed the same tactics. They convened people to create what was called the Global Climate Science Communications Plan. Representatives of ExxonMobil, of Chevron, of Southern Company, which is a very large coal-burning utility, as well as a lot of the front groups we know, were either in attendance or were named in this document to make the media think there were two sides to report about climate change science, to confuse people about the reality, and to make the uncertainties part of the conventional wisdom about climate change. All right, so this is the part of the presentation that I really skipped over yesterday for the people that saw or are getting to see both of these. The power of the State Policy Network, of which all of these groups are associate members. There are the state-level think tanks that Nick talked about. So every single state has at least one State Policy Network member group. They were modeled off the Heritage Foundation, which is one of the most influential conservative think tanks in Washington, D.C. So there are 64 of those. The Texas Public Policy Foundation is the main one here in Texas. I'll get to that later. They also have associate members, and that's what some of these are. So the Cato Institute, which was founded by Charles Koch, Americans for Prosperity, also founded by the Koch brothers. The Heritage Foundation, Grover Norquist's Americans for Tax Reform. These are all groups that are part of the State Policy Network family. Officially, they are affiliated. And they are meant to look like disparate voices. Who are these experts from all these smart-sounding groups that are coming and denying various problems that people are actually having in order to usually enrich the people that are the executives of the companies causing the problems? This is one worth pointing out. I did mention this yesterday. One of the newer evolutions of the State Policy Network is what is called the Franklin Center for Government and Public Integrity. If you've ever seen Watchdog.org, the Watchdog Texas Bureau, in Pennsylvania, it's called the Pennsylvania Independent. It's these faux news outlets. They're made to look like credible blogging and news websites. They're part of the State Policy Network. In fact, most of their funding is completely hidden. In 2012, 80% of their money was dark money, and 90% of it back in 2011. Again, here are the members of the State Policy Network here in Texas, the two official members being the Texas Public Policy Foundation and the Texas Conservative Coalition Research Institute. But there's other State Policy Network affiliates here, of course, FreedomWorks and Americans for Prosperity, the National Center for Policy Analysis, very involved in climate change denial. I was looking at the Justice Foundation's website today. There's a lot of very disturbing stuff about trying to prevent women's access to abortion services if they need it. The Americans Prosperity and Texas Public Policy Foundation in particular are really pushing to privatize schools here. So they tend to coalesce around issues, and it creates an amplification effect that politicians really respond to. Donors Trust, I mentioned that the Franklin Center and a lot of these groups increasingly are being funded by dark money, which we're talking about. This is one of the main conduits we've now discovered for this dark money. So a billionaire like Charles Koch can donate to Donors Trust, and indeed he does, millions of dollars every year. And then that hub of money obscures the millionaires and billionaires and companies that are giving the money to it so that it can then disseminate money to the groups that it's funding. And you don't have that traceability of who is ultimately funding certain projects. In 2002, Donors Trust and its sister organization, Donors Capital Fund, disseminated $1.4 million in 2002. By 2012, they were sending out $96 million in dark money. Again, this is efforts to attack people's wage, attack the prevailing wage, attack efforts to raise the minimum wage, to suppress people who are legitimate voters, attacking women's health care, attacking everybody's health care, privatizing education. These are all things that I think tie into the theme of the evening of human rights. And it's important to recognize that there are a few different ways the money reaches these groups. So Donors Trust is a complicated special case, but again, taking the Koch brothers as a case study, they own Koch Industries. They're the majority shareholders of this private company. Sometimes they cut checks directly from Koch Industries to the Texas Public Policy Foundation. They definitely do that. Sometimes David Koch himself will just write a $100,000 check to these groups, and that's not disclosed. If it's a private check from him to somebody else, we don't know that unless we get lucky. And then they have foundations that they run, the Charles G. Koch Foundation, the David H. Koch Foundation. They had another one that they just shut down. Those nonprofit foundations also funnel tens of millions of dollars every year. It's not funny. And the Koch world, as it's nicknamed by certain reporters, is becoming increasingly complicated. They had a finance network that I would love to show you if I could get to it. That is really, I'm not going to be able to show you right now. That is increasingly sophisticated. So the Kochs have now set up a network of limited liability corporations that are involved in funneling money, as well as their own chamber of commerce, a 501c6 nonprofit, which is a fairly unusual arrangement. But they're sending out, they poured over $250 million into the 2012 election, mostly into issue-based groups, the Center to Protect Patient Rights, which got in trouble for violating campaign finance laws in California, Americans Prosperity, all the way down the line. So they are increasingly, in response to activists who are discovering what they're up to, making it harder and harder to trace the money that they're sending to these groups that are doing all the issues that we're talking about. In terms of climate change denial, again, Koch Industries really hit our radar when we realized that they were vastly outspending ExxonMobil in terms of what they're funding. Exxon is on the bottom there, brown. You can see that Exxon's, at least their traceable donations to groups that deny the science of climate change, slowly declined over time. A lot of that was a result to public pressure provided by GreenPeace and other groups to embarrass them with people like the Hartman Institute, who have compared those who accept climate change science to the Unabomber in a billboard they put up. Then the Koch foundations are there in orange, and then Donors Trust, this dark money hub that I told you about, is increasingly a conduit to hide money to these organizations who really, ultimately, it seems, embarrass the funders if they're trying to hide this money. I'm going to skip that. So, it's also important to know, I've been using Charles and David up there in the top right as an example. There are a lot of these old money families that have foundations that are doing the same exact thing. They're not quite as active as Charles and David Koch are in terms of actually convening other corporate executives and politicians and favorable reporters at meetings. The Kochs are really involved in getting a whole community of plutocrats together. But there's the Lyndon Harry Bradley Foundation, the Searle Freedom Trust. Richard Mellon Scaife up there in the top left just died The Coors Family Foundation of Coors Brewing. So a lot of old money foundations that are coordinated by certain hubs. The Philanthropy Roundtable is an odd organization where a lot of them plan their funding and coordinate it. And the State Policy Network, of course, being a unifying hub that coordinates these agendas for the groups. You know, if you're Charles and David Koch, you want to get a result, it's much better to fund the groups at the national level, at the state level, increasingly at the international level, and make sure they're coordinating the way you want them to when you're giving them money. And they've said things. So David Koch has said, you know, if we're going to give a lot of money to an organization, we're going to make darn sure they go on with our intent, and that's a direct quote. Lewis Powell, 2 minutes, thank you. Lewis Powell was a Supreme Court justice. He was appointed by Richard Nixon, but before he was appointed, he wrote a memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce about the attack on free enterprise in the United States of America. He suggested, in short, 4 avenues that business people should really get serious about funding in order to increase their influence. One was funding politicians in the political sector through lobbying, through campaign finance, the things that we're seeing that we're more familiar with than I would say a lot of these other things. Media was another huge realm. He decided the corporations did not have enough control in the media, and they needed to consolidate. They needed to control the media's influence through advertising and a variety of other methods to make sure that they were getting favorable coverage. He suggested influencing the court system and justices. There's a group called the Federalist Society, and there's also co-funded groups at, say, George Mason University that host junkets for judges who often actually end up ruling favorably in cases after they attend these seminars that are funded by the corporations that might get cases later that these judges rule upon. And then the last one was education. Lewis Powell said, especially in higher ed, there's a bunch of crazy lefty liberal professors who need to be controlled, and we need to start getting our people in there. And Charles Koch took that one to heart more than anybody else I'm familiar with. In fact, just 3 years after this memo was written, Charles Koch himself gave a speech for the Institute for Humane Studies. That is another group that he is the chairman of at George Mason University. And the Institute for Humane Studies recruits students into the think tanks that Charles Koch funds. And they get stipends for housing, and they get paid. And it's a really tempting thing if you're a student, as I mentioned to the folks that saw me yesterday. You get out of college right now, we're not in a good economy still, it's hard to get a job, and here's somebody waving money right in your face. You're going to network with powerful people, you're going to make a difference, maybe not a good difference, but you'll make one. So that is kind of the plan of attack that Charles Koch and others took to heart. I'll wrap with this. People saw this yesterday. This is how the State Policy Network can work around a single state and issue. In Kansas, there was an attack on clean energy. There was actually an attack on clean energy incentives in many states last year. Kansas was one of the most heated battles, where an ALEC bill popped up by a legislator that's affiliated with them. He's probably here in Dallas this week. And the attack on the renewable energy standard in Kansas, which means make more clean energy over time for your utility company, it was justified by a Boston-based group called the Beacon Hill Institute, and it had a report that was widely debunked saying electricity prices go up if you have more renewable energy. So they used this scary report to justify a bad policy that was introduced by an ALEC legislator. Americans for Prosperity in Kansas was active in promoting that bill, as was the Kansas Policy Institute. That's the official state policy network group in Kansas. Koch Industries had its own lobbyist, a man named Jonathan Small, was lobbying directly to make sure this bill would be supported. They flew in a climate change denier scientist from Alabama who was not credible in the world of climate science, but he wanted to assure the legislature that climate change isn't a big enough deal to merit these clean energy laws. Here comes Grover Norquist, the president of DC's Americans for Tax Reform, one of the top lobbyists in the country, saying, you know, this is a tax on affordable energy to mandate more clean energy, just more political lip service to the ALEC play. And they flew in a guy named Chris Horner, who's from a couple different groups in DC, funded by the Kochs, at least CEI is. And he, again, belittled the science of climate change in order to make it sound like clean energy laws aren't needed and that they're too expensive, also untrue. James Taylor, he's from the Heartland Institute. That's the group that says you're a terrorist if you believe in global warming. Willie Soon's research says that polar bears won't be harmed from global warming and that the sun is causing global warming, both very disproved, redundantly disproved. That research was funded, we know, by ExxonMobil, by Southern Company, by Charles Koch, by Donors Trust. And that's how the state policy network coalesced around the clean energy law in Kansas. So that's a visual, that's just, and remember this also happened in North Carolina, most of the same people flying in North Carolina. In Ohio, the only state where they succeeded in freezing the clean energy law, the same groups came in. And there were a total of 16 states where something like this happened, but those were the 3 states where it was the most dramatic coordination against it. I'll stop there on the state policy network.
Holy crap.